Good evening. I'm Rob Saldine, the Director of Ethics and Public Affairs at the Mansfield Center and a Professor of Political Science at the University of Montana. Thanks for joining us this evening for the Mansfield Dialogue. The Mansfield Center advances ethical leadership, civic responsibility, and international understanding. Grounded in the legacy of Mike and Maureen Mansfield, the center seeks to foster civil exchanges across diverse viewpoints, reinforces the importance of democratic institutions, and examines the role that ethical values play in public life. Tonight's event is part of the Mansfield Dialogues, our community education series designed to provide public access to notable speakers addressing these important topics. And our dialogue this evening, which focuses on a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, I think will be a fantastic example of what the series aims to do. It's a great pleasure to welcome Robert Doar. Mr. Doar is president of the American Enterprise Institute, one of Washington's preeminent think tanks. Prior to joining AEI in 2014, he spent over 2 decades in leadership roles in the social service programs of New York State and New York City. At AEI, he has co-chaired the National Commission on Hunger and served as a lead member of the AEI Brookings Working Group on Poverty and Opportunity. He is the editor of A Safety Net That Works, Improving Federal Programs for Low-Income Americans, and a contributing author to This Way Up, New Thinking About Poverty and Economic Mobility, as well as Opportunity, Responsibility, and Security, a consensus plan for reducing poverty and restoring the American dream, among various other projects. Tonight, he'll be drawing in part, again, on this recent Wall Street Journal op-ed that revisits the lessons of the 1960s civil rights era and considers what they might suggest for contemporary political and civic life in Minnesota and beyond. After his remarks, Mr. Doar will take some questions from the audience, so please do submit yours using the Q&A feature. Robert, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here. I greatly appreciate the invitation. I have, in my reading of history, a great respect and admiration for Senator Mansfield. And so when I received the invitation from Dina, I was very happy to say yes and to see if I could contribute to the conversation with your organization. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And I think the way we decided to do this is I would give some remarks about my op-ed and my background and what led me to write the op-ed and what the reaction to it was, what I was trying to convey, and then we can open it up for questions. And so that's what I'm going to do. Just a little add-on to the background. I was for almost 20 years a social services administrator for Republican or right of center leaders in New York State, for Governor Pataki, and then for Mike Bloomberg. And my background is welfare reform or poverty alleviation through work and family and personal responsibility, along with supports that come from government. We had some success in that in New York State and New York City during the late 90s and through the 2000s, the first decade of the 2000s. And then I was recruited to come here to use the platform that the American Enterprise Institute offers to people who are knowledgeable about public policy, either through their experience or through their academic background or journalistic background, to project their ideas into the public dialogue. It was fun for me because I had worked for governor and a mayor, and it was time for me at that point in my life to be able to speak for myself and be able to say what I had learned. And so I used what we offer here at AEI, which is basically a platform to participate in the public debate through research papers, partnerships with other organizations where we produce consensus reports, testimonies to legislators in the federal, in the House and the Senate, or often in state houses, and other ways of participating in the public debate on the issues that I knew best, which was poverty and opportunity. But my predecessor left, who ran the whole organization. We do much more than that topic here at AEI. We have a big economics department. We have a big foreign and defense department. We have a big department on what we call social, culture, and constitutional studies. And so when my predecessor left, I missed managing and felt that, I wanted AEI to stay true to its principles, and we can talk about those later. And so I raised my hand and they made me president. So that made me have to learn and be kind of representative of a much broader organization instead of policy issues. And I do that in the way that I do it in a variety of ways. And so while mostly I participate in the public debate on poverty and opportunity type issues, I occasionally will weigh in on something that I think is of particular importance and that I have something unique or different or special to say. And one other aspect about my background that's important is that I grew up in a household where my father had a big involvement in public life. He was a Republican from Northwest Wisconsin, way up up by Minneapolis and St. Paul. He came to Washington to work for President Eisenhower at the very end of the Eisenhower administration. And he came to work in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department of the United States government. And he began in those early years of being in the Justice Department some of the most important voting rights cases concerning the civil rights movement and representing the federal government through the Civil Rights Division. When the Kennedys won election, they looked around and he was in a political position, but they decided that they liked his work and they liked him, and so they kept him. And so he was this Republican from Wisconsin who had no real connection previously to the Kennedy administration or the Kennedys, who they thought would be useful to have as the first assistant in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. Over the next 7 years or 8 years, he then became kind of the federal man in the South during the really, really tense period of the civil rights movement. First as the first assistant, and then he became the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And so he was with James Meredith when we desegregated the University of Mississippi. He was there in Alabama when the University of Alabama was desegregated. He was very active in the Selma and Montgomery March, where he represented the federal government on all of that was going on there. He prosecuted 2 murder trials involving the murderers of Viola Liuzzo at the Selma and Montgomery March, and the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Neshoba County, Mississippi, by the Klan in Mississippi. Those were successful prosecutions in federal court that led to convictions before local jurors. So he had a big role, let's just say, and I'll leave that to those of you who want to study the history of the civil rights movement and look into John Doar and the Civil Rights Division. You'll see that what I'm saying is accurate in every particular. He was the man in the South representing the federal government as it tried to bring big change to that part of the country, so that part of the country respected and honored the rights of African Americans in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, Virginia, the whole South. And so having seen that as a child growing up, we lived in Washington when he was in the Civil Rights Division. I was interested in public life and wanted to get in public life. I went a little different path on different issues. He worked in civil rights, I worked in poverty, but I am very informed by that work. And I'm, as I say, very conscious of the remarkable contribution of Congress in the civil rights movement, both of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which of course Senator Mansfield played a large role. And so I know that history pretty well. And I'm proud of that history. I think there are aspects of what we did as a country in the civil rights movement that reflect very favorably on how we tackle a difficult problem. We had setbacks and difficulties, and not everything went perfectly, but over time, successful change was achieved, and our country got better. Happy to talk about that with anyone on those issues and discuss that, but that was really, I think, something that was inspiring to me. So I was out at this is now a little bit of how a think tank president goes about his business and thinks. I was out at a conference with a bunch of other people who are viewed as kind of right of center. AEI is a right of center organization. I believe in sort of certain conservative principles. And this was a partner entity of some significance, more libertarian than us, and when the really troubling issues were taking place, events were taking place in Minneapolis, I was watching the news like everybody else. And I knew that everyone there at this gathering could not possibly be happy about the way in which the federal government was using its power and authority in a locality, Minneapolis. But nobody really wanted to say anything. Nobody really got up and said, "Wait a minute, this isn't right." And it upset me to such an extent that I went back to my hotel room and I typed out this article, this op-ed. And we have the American Enterprise Institute has many scholars who write for the Wall Street Journal, we write for the New York Times, we write for lots of publications. So we know the editors of that the op-ed page and the editorial page. And so I sent a note to Paul Gigot and James Toronto, who are the editors of that page, and said, I'm upset about. I don't know if I said I'm upset, but I've written this, and I need to know, are you going to run it? Because I'll take it somewhere else if you won't. And within 30 minutes, they wrote back and said, we'll take it, and a couple little tweaks because that's the way editors of newspapers can be, and we worked that out. And Tuesday morning it ran. Now to the substance of it. The key thing that I was troubled by, well, there are many things that I was troubled by, but the key thing that I was troubled by is that it's true that there will be instances where the federal government, for whatever reason, maybe good reasons, maybe bad reasons, but for whatever reason, will want to bring change and use its power in states and in cities. And my view and my father's view of those interactions was that they had to be respectful of federalism. They had to acknowledge that, and this is the most fundamental point, that in the United States, we have a federalist system where the states and federal governments are parallel, not subordinate. It is not the federal government over the state governments. It's the state governments in some spheres have certain responsibilities, and the federal government in other spheres has other responsibilities, and they need to be respectful of their different roles. In many contexts, that important, respectful relationship is abused, but it's especially difficult when the federal government decides that it needs or wants or has some desire to use police power. Because there, what my father would say is that there is no federal police force in the United States, and there shouldn't be. The law enforcement responsibilities reside principally and should reside principally with the local entities, either state or city governments. And for us to have a all-powerful federal police force coming into places far distant from Washington is a very dangerous and unappetizing circumstance. There are circumstances where it may be necessary, but it always should be a last resort. And what was happening in Minneapolis and has happened in other places with the use of these enforcement agents representing ICE and the Department of Homeland Security was not respectful of that appropriate relationship between the federal government and the localities. And they were finding themselves clearly out of their depth. They weren't able to really successfully or appropriately or properly bring their power to bear. They were untrained, and disasters happened. People were killed. And that just seemed to me to be, a classic error on the part of the federal government in its use of power in a locality in Minneapolis. Leaving aside, the merits of the particular issue, what was happening, we can talk about immigration in a minute, but it just didn't seem correct. So what I landed on, and I'm not sure entirely in the analogy to the civil rights movement, this is the right term, but what I landed on was restraint. That in implementing and enforcing and in bringing to bear the power of the federal government in the area of civil rights during the 1960s, under the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration, with the guidance of my father, there was a respectfulness to the localities that led them to be restrained. And this led to conflict with advocates for the movement and others who thought, what are you being restrained about? You should exert your power in the most aggressive way possible to enforce or protect civil rights workers in the South. But the attitude of the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration was, we can do that, but that won't really help the problem for the long term, because we will not have got local buy-in. We will not have won or persuaded, and we will not have used the instruments of government available to us at the local level to appropriately bring change to bear. And we could talk about lots of examples of where that worked and where that didn't work. But their view was that once you got people to voluntarily comply with whatever it is, you would get more lasting long-term change. And in the South, when it comes to voting rights, that ultimate voluntary compliance, I mean, it just is borne out by the voting numbers in all across the South among blacks compared to what it used to be in the past. So that was number one. The second was that Dad in the Civil Rights Movement and the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Movement were extremely respectful of the appropriate legal processes. So when they were trying to impose change in Mississippi or Alabama, they went through the courts. It was extremely important that they went through the legal process of persuading the federal judiciary. Sometimes they weren't always successful, but eventually they were. And they got very prominent federal judges, often Republican appointees, by the way, to the federal judiciary in the South, to rule against the local leaders in Mississippi and Alabama and in support of the civil rights movement. That was enormously powerful. So very famous judges, Judge Frank Johnson in Alabama, Elbert Tuttle in the Fifth Circuit, John Minor Wisdom in Louisiana, Richard Reeves, John Brown. These were enormously brave, mostly Republican appointees, I think all Republican appointees, who ruled against the power structure of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana in support of the civil rights movement and of the Civil Rights Division in its effort to protect and enhance the rights of African Americans in the South. Well, that was very powerful. It was hard. It took time. It went through, it required a lot of litigation, but ultimately it was much stronger. It had a stronger basis for change in that area in that part of the country. So that was a second. The third is that they recognized that Congress had a role, and that at some point change being driven by the executive branch, even with all the powers of the executive branch, is not going to last if it isn't accompanied by congressional action. And so they, let's just assume for a moment, as determined as they might have been in the Johnson administration or the Kennedy administration to get these results when it came to civil rights, let's assume that's what their view was. They needed to know that in order for it to be long-term successful, they needed the voice of the people, the Congress, to act. And so frustrating, difficult, slow, irritating, they went to Senator Mansfield. They went to the House Judiciary Committee in the House on Civil Rights Act, and they went through the process of getting the votes they needed to do these important things. And some people like to say, well, that's so obvious. It's so easy. Why didn't they just make it happen? And it actually wasn't so easy, and it wasn't so obvious to everybody. But in order to make it lasting and effective, it was important to go through the congressional process. And so the history, and I commend this to all of you, and those of you who are great students of Senator Mansfield, you know the history. The passage of the Civil Rights Act and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, they are two of the greatest achievements of the United States Congress. But they didn't happen, with a snap of the fingers. They took work and effort and negotiation. And the Justice Department under my father's leadership in the Civil Rights Division and the leadership of the presidents were understanding of that. So here we have respect for the localities, respect for federalism. Was that the way the President Trump's administration was going about enforcing immigration policy in Minneapolis or other places around the country? No. Respect for the courts, making sure that we're doing things consistent with the courts, being responsive to what the courts are going to insist on when it comes to protecting the liberties of Americans, being sure that it's done correctly in a way that will stand up if it's reviewed by a court. Was that the way the Trump administration was going about enforcing immigration policy in Minneapolis? No, there's a lot of evidence of a failure there. And then finally, there's a lot wrong with immigration policy. There's a lot of issues with regard to immigration policy, but is this being worked out through Congress? Was it worked out through Congress in the previous administration? No. They're trying to do things fast, quick, lots of publicity, lots of attention, but no real effort to make it last and be done in a way that earns the respect and support of the vast majority of Americans. And so when I thought about that, I said, there's just some lessons here from how you bring about big change. And now we'll talk a little bit about the nature of the change that the civil rights movement seemed to do correctly over the long haul, judged fairly, and the Trump administration was failing. And I wanted to put that out there and say this is not working. Now, I also made at least one other point about it, and which is important, and that is there is a great disenchantment and anger in the country about the way immigration policy has been implemented in the United States over the last 10 years. There has been a lawlessness to it, and there's been a failure to recognize that people who come into the United States should come in legally and appropriately. And so what the Trump administration is trying to do with regard to immigration policy, first of all, is clearly supported by the American people. President Trump, in some respects, won his election because the American people were fed up with a failure to, quote, control the border and limit illegal immigration. And so the policy objective that the president had, or the president's people had, which was to limit or counter illegal immigration, either by stopping people at the border or deporting people that were here illegal, it's a legitimate concern. And there are issues with it that we could talk about, but as a sort of execution of a politically supported policy, I would say he has some justification in going about that. And then comes to my last point. But in the way the Trump administration was doing it, they were undermining the political support that they had earned for the very policy. And that's just, you can see that in the polling numbers. You can see that in the absolute collapse of support for the Trump administration and the Trump and the Republican Party among Hispanic Americans that they had earned because of this, what I would call overzealous immigration enforcement. And that's just, that's just what's happened. And I'll give you a way of illustrating that. And by the way, this is here now. I'm in Washington. I spend a lot of time with members of Congress, a lot of time with staff and people that are talking to people in Congress. The Republicans in Congress believe, they won't say this necessarily publicly, that the president is marching them off a cliff politically by this overzealous enforcement. And it makes them, some of them heartbroken because they had won a big chunk of the Hispanic vote in districts all across the country and in the national numbers. And they had won them because, for very good reason, Hispanic Americans and Hispanic Americans who are citizens and voters had been more attracted to their program on the economy, on social and cultural issues like faith and family and patriotism than they were with the Democrats. And as a result, I was at the same event I was at, and there was a candidate for Senate in one of the major swing states who said in the last race, I won 52%. This is a Republican candidate of the Hispanic vote in my state. Very proud. He's now running again 2 years later. If he doesn't get more than 48% of that vote, he has no chance of winning. And he has no chance of getting more than 48% of that vote. So here we have, some hard-won political victories by the Trump administration among a swing constituency that they were basically just kicking away with this overzealous enforcement. So the last part of the piece makes that reference. You can build up a reputation over a lifetime, and you can destroy it with over one weekend. And I believe to some extent that happened with the way in which they went about using federal power to enforce or to bring to bear a policy objective that the federal government had that was in conflict with the state. Last point, and I made this point, and this is one part of the op-ed that I got some response from many parts of the op-ed, but this last part I want to say very clearly. It was also troubling to me to watch the way in which the protesters in Minneapolis were confronting the federal agents and were approaching this issue. And, admittedly, when you watch something on TV, you get a slice of it or a piece of it. You don't see the whole picture. But it looked to me, and I'm sure it looked to many other Americans, that there were aspects of the protesters in Minneapolis that were harassing law enforcement officers of the federal government, whether it was with whistling or shouting or other kinds of disruptive behavior. And that didn't look to me like the manner that Dr. King and the leaders of the civil rights movement in the South went about their nonviolent protesting of really egregious behavior on the part of the South. Far, by the way, well, let's not compare them. Just say very difficult injustice that they faced, and they approached it with their method of protesting that was much different than what I saw in Minneapolis. And that it was almost, to some extent, there was a sort of a daring them to instigate violence. And that was not consistent with what I felt the civil rights movement in its overwhelming behavior exhibited. And so there's a paragraph in the piece that says it's not just the federal government that's overreaching, it's the protesters too, and we ought to take a lesson from it. Now, I had a little benefit there, because, again, if you're reading op-eds, you guys called me because you read on op-ed. Roland Fryer's op-ed from the week before in the Journal, because Dr. King's birthday was in the same period, about the strategy of nonviolent protest that Dr. King exhibited. It's very hard to write something new and different in memory of Dr. King. We know Dr. King. We've all tried to commemorate his birthday at the anniversary. He's one of the great American heroes. But Roland Fryer, who, by the way, is not an AEI scholar, although I wish he was, but he's affiliated with another right of center think tank. He's African American, Harvard economist, wrote a beautiful piece about why Dr. King's method of protest was actually not weak but strong and effective, even though it came across as restrained or peaceful. And he described the strategy was, this is the way we win supporters. And so I referenced that. It's always good for editors of an op-ed page to have a piece that references a previous piece, because it's like a pat on the back. And that's also in the piece. Now, I've got one last thing, and then I'll stop, because you've asked me to talk about the piece. When you write these sorts of things, after you write them and they publish them, you look at them and you say, well, wait a minute, I didn't really get that right. That's not quite right. And you have regrets, and you say, gee, because 800 words is hard. you got to summarize a big topic you're trying to get across, and you might skimp a little. And this goes to actually a little bit about Senator Mansfield. Restraint is not the right word about the way in which the Civil Rights Division went about its work in the South in the 1960s. There was nothing restrained about them. They were actually extremely active. They were all over the place. They were working, brutal hours. And, Dad and his people, they were in Louisiana on one day and Mississippi on the next and Alabama the next. And to the people in the South who opposed integration and opposed rights for Black Americans, they didn't feel like the power of the federal government was restrained. And ultimately, with regard to sort of the desegregation of Ole Miss or the enrollment of James Meredith, the federal government ultimately said, no, we're doing this. The federal court says you're doing this, and we're doing this. And so I felt a little guilty because I said restrained. I would say it's disciplined. It was strategic. It was careful. It was prudent, but it was not restraint. The power of the federal government in implementing and in enforcing civil rights policy in the Kennedy and Johnson administration was ultimately quite powerful and quite effective, and especially after the Congress passed the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. So I had a little bit of guilt about maybe that I went overboard on restraint, and to those who really know that issue, I've written a little mea culpa that maybe I didn't get that quite right. But when you're writing fast and you're mad about what I thought was an injustice and a tragedy and an embarrassment to our country, and you want to get it across, you get it out fast, and when they say we'll publish it, it's done, and you don't have time to rethink, wordsmith every word. So that's a little glimpse of how a think tank president thinks about how to participate in the public debate using the op-ed pages of a major newspaper, and how I think about that issue and why I wrote that piece and how it came about. So you invited me to tell you that story. I've told it. I think I've covered all the details, but maybe I missed one or two. But why don't we stop now, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Robert. That was fantastic, both in terms of setting the venue in terms of Washington and the think tank world, and also just giving a great overview of the piece. And let's look at some of the questions. We got one that presses you on some of the points you were talking about there at the end, in particular, and especially this analogy. So this questioner notes that in the 1960s, federal officials were acting to ensure that constitutional rights were honored in the face of resistant state governments. But in today's dispute, that relationship between federal and state authorities is inverted. And so when you call on both sides to show restraint, is that something of a false equivalent between a federal government that was enforcing the Constitution in the 1960s and, by contrast, one that multiple courts and state officials argue is violating it today?
Well, I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, to the people in the South who were also students of the Constitution, there were elements of the aggressive enforcement by the federal government of the civil rights policies that they seemed weren't consistent with the Constitution either. And then secondly, I would say, and I'm not saying they were right, but I'm just saying, that actually goes to the problem is one side says, well, it doesn't really matter. We're right and they're wrong. We're right and they're wrong. And when you do that, you're not really allowing the process to be worked out in, I think, an effective way. And the second thing I would say is, to many Americans, the presence in the United States of people who are here illegally is a violation of the rule of law. And so it's not entirely clear to me that it's automatically true that someone who says, well, we should find them. And of course, the stated policy was we only really want to find the ones who are also convicted of a criminal offense and move them to be quickly deported, which is consistent with the rules of the law of the United States. So I'm not so sure that the best answer is we were right and they were wrong. We're doing the Constitution's work and they're not, because that's not how both sides see it. And so, that's my answer to that. I mean, I think, so we'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, and one more on this general topic, and that is drawing an analogy between the federal response back in the 60s and that of the civil rights movement and its leaders, Martin Luther King and so forth. It does seem like that's maybe not analogous to what's going on in Minnesota in the sense of how quickly this emerged, right? And obviously we can say there were these problems, significant problems in the Jim Crow South before the laws that you mentioned. But the situation in Minneapolis emerged awfully quickly, right? And I think there was a sense of crisis, and that the people on the streets in Minneapolis didn't necessarily have the time to develop the discipline and the strategy that, say, the civil rights leaders did in their efforts. What do you think about that critique?
Well, I think if you look at the TikTok or the day-to-day demand on the country in the period of 1960 to 1965, you would find that a lot of crises developed awfully fast in hotspots around the South. And it was incumbent on parties of all kinds, the courts, the leaders in the localities, and the federal government to respond quickly and figure out how to resolve them. And so I'm not so sure that saying, well, things moved too quickly here and we didn't know what we were doing. The Freedom Riders, the history of the Freedom Riders was, that came up pretty quickly. And the March, Selma Montgomery, we think now that the whole country was focused on that for all of the period leading up to it, but that's actually not true. The crisis in Birmingham, when the dogs and the police officers and the fire hoses, these things happen fast. Medgar Evers was killed. And then there was, the almost riot in Jackson. These things happen very fast. And so my own opinion is that given the crisis and the demand and the tension, the federal government in the previous period didn't do everything right, but handled these very hot, difficult, fast-moving events much better than the situation in Minneapolis in the current administration. I mean, the bulk of the piece is a critique of the Trump administration's actions in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And for them to say, if the gist of your question is to say, poor DHS, they're moving fast, they're trying to get a lot done, and they can't keep up, and that's, in my opinion, that doesn't excuse their behavior at all.
Yeah.
So, and on the Minnesota side, again, I just don't think it's helpful to harass law enforcement officers, period. I don't think that is the way you go about earning the support of the American people. I mean, Andy Young used to say quite clearly, we won America, not the advocates, not our side, not the blacks. We won America by how we conducted our protest. And I want the my own position is that I have a certain view on immigration policy, and it doesn't support what the Trump administration is doing. And I want us to win America for that policy. And I'm not sure that harassing law enforcement officers is the best way to do that.
Yeah, yeah, understood and fair enough. Although I said we were only going to do one more on this, and I do want to get to some of the other aspects of the piece, but I got to ask you one more, Robert, and that is, um, yes, point taken in terms of some of the major events of the civil rights movement. You know, these were crisis events that had to be responded to quickly. In terms of the movement, though, they were able to bring a pretty well fleshed out sense of how we deal with these things. So they weren't having to come up with something on the fly. There was a general approach to these things that was developed over a long period of time. And yes, there's a crisis here, crisis there, but you have a general disposition in terms of how you're going to deal with it. And that was put together by people whose job it was to think these things through. And in Minneapolis, I mean, you have some of those people, I suppose, but even the elected officials and the advocates groups, they are dealing with something new.
That's fair.
Um, right. And a lot of what's going on with the harassment you're talking about, that's just everyday citizens, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and so that's a little different.
I think that's a good point. But the only thing I would just say to that is that this immigration issue, from the perspective of the left, or the pro-immigration side, which in some respects I'm on. We support immigration at AEI. We like immigration. Um, we've had a lot of time to figure out how to put together a program or a response to people that are concerned about illegal immigration and concerned about illegal immigrants who have committed crimes. And I don't know this is not my core issue. I worry about a lot of things, but I don't really know what, and you mentioned the movement. I don't know what the movement who are supportive of protecting immigrants in the United States or opposing the Trump administration, I don't really know what their position is on illegal immigrants who have been convicted of a crime. I mean, so they ought to figure that out and then say, we're for this, but we're not for this. Or we have this other where we are more open and supportive and celebratory of immigrants. So when you say they had time to get the previous movement and the civil rights movement had time to figure it out and to put together a plan and a sort of program, one of the sadness about my own view about the Democratic Party or the left, the party on the left, immigration policies is that they've not come to it's all or nothing, or no one is ever illegal, or everybody should be able to come to the United States and be entitled to all of our benefits. And that doesn't seem to me to be a program that is politically saleable. And there needs to be some middle ground, something in between that they can say, no, this is what we're for. And I haven't heard it.
Yeah. Well, maybe we could talk a little bit about immigration. As you note, I mean, you are tend to be on the pro-immigration side, and I think that would characterize AEI as an institution as well. Although, one of the I think things that a lot of people don't fully appreciate about think tanks is that there's a lot of internal divisions, at least at some, including AEI and Brookings and others. Another think tank model would be much more homogenous and everybody's on the same page. But generally, I think it would be fair to say that AEI has been on the pro-immigration side of things. And yes, the position you cite on the left of this issue, or associated with the Democratic Party and progressive activists and so forth, I think there's a reasonable case to be made that they don't fully engage the issue in trying to come to a kind of comprehensive solution. And yet we got this interesting question from someone who was intrigued with the comments you referenced from the Republican legislator. and asks, why don't some of these members of Congress on the Republican side speak up? Because, Robert, as you well know, it was not that long ago that there was a large swath of the Republican Party who held a view very similar to your own. And we don't hear from these people, or to the extent we do, we hear them more in the form of commentators observing the
Yeah,
process rather than as people who actually have power within an important institution.
because of the power of the president in primaries. It's all about that. President Trump and his people are the most aggressive president, the most aggressive executive I've ever seen in down ballot discipline or down ballot revenge against people in their own party who don't agree with them on every issue. And in the old days, you could have a president take a position, and people in his party say, "Well, that's very good, but I'm not going to support that position, and I'll be fine," and everybody would be fine, and the president would have very little power to do anything about it because that was beyond their political capital to expend and to lead to results. But that's not the case right now. The Republican members of the House and Senate are just basically worried and paralyzed by fear of primary candidates and President Trump's entire um, disregard for them or their political fortunes. So if they cross him, as he did just in the last couple of days, he will say, "I support this fringe primary candidate who has no experience, no ability, doesn't really have any real reputation to run on, but he's not you, and you broke with me, and I'm going after you." And that is a powerful thing in politics. It always would be a powerful thing. No politician wants to face a primary, but usually it's not enforceable because you don't have a president who is willing to do this. But in this case, we do. So that's the concern, and that's why they are reluctant to challenge him on issues that he cares about.
Well, given that, another question we got asks about the difficulties of getting something through Congress, right? How do we break through that, either to get some sort of stable solution that's more to your liking, or a more stable solution to the liking of the president? Because whatever's going on in Minneapolis, that's not a great long-term solution, even if you're very sympathetic to the Trump administration's approach to immigration.
Yeah, I completely agree. All I would say about that, again, is a good analogy to what happened in the 60s. These were equally contentious issues, and the country was divided in a similar way. And but good people of good faith worked really hard and did the groundwork, and Congress had a role, and they went through regular order and they figured out how to do it. It took a long time. So it's doable on a contentious issue, but right now the parties are preserving the grievance and preserving the issue instead of trying to solve it. Now, the only thing I would just add to that, and this is, if you live by the headlines and you live by the constant news feed that tells you how bad things are or how bad the other guys are, you would miss that actually a lot does get through Congress. They're not high profile issues, but they're important, and important legislation does pass. The House has done all their appropriations bills. It's very quiet. No one really knows this, but President Trump proposed a lot of things. Most of them were rejected, and the House passed bills that got through the House with bipartisan votes. It's the nitty gritty of legislation. It's specific things that aren't high profile or are not high priority to the Trump administration. But, Congress does do things. It's not a completely, but on something like immigration, where people preserve the issue as opposed to make a solution, and you don't have leadership, both sides get a benefit for the issue remaining unsolved. And there's an unwillingness to compromise. We haven't been able to solve it. But, just not to make political points, but it's worth pointing out that this is what the frustration in the country is about, is that in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, when there was really a serious problem with people coming across the border illegally, he claimed he could do nothing about it. I have no power. I need Congress. I can't fix this. This requires. And then when he realized how badly it was damaging his popularity and the country's sense of the rule of law, somehow or another, in the last year, illegal traffic across the country was diminished greatly. And that made people think, well, wait a minute, you said before you couldn't solve it. Now you've apparently done things with the executive branch authority that have solved it or lessened it. What's that about? So that breaks down your trust and respect for the leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly I take your point on sort of the hidden Congress or the secret Congress, right?
Yeah.
Francis Lee, a political scientist at Princeton, has great work on that and argues that, actually Congress does do a lot. It's not on the high profile stuff. It does seem like
I'm
that
showing Francis Lee's book right here. She's one of my favorites. She's at Princeton. We're featuring, and we're big fan of her book In COVID's Wake, which is a spectacular book about the way elites screwed up COVID. And she's a woman of the left. And I've never, all the description of, not to go on a tangent here, but she's spectacular. And her latest book, which is not on Congress, which is a real specialty, but is about COVID, is spectacular. And I recommend it to all you should have her on your next podcast or whatever this is.
That's a good thought. It does seem like maybe the secret Congress bit is a little overstated. You look at what actually Congress does. I mean, a lot of it that gets tallied up as something that gets done is like, in the naming post office kind of category.
Yeah, I agree completely. I don't want to overstate it. They are broken. Yeah, we have a whole initiative here on the first on just Congress is broken. I acknowledge that. It's a real problem. We need new leaders. We need somebody that can get it going again.
Yeah, well, maybe you could speak a little bit to that in terms of, how do we get out of this mess? You mentioned new leaders. I mean, like, easier said than done. But what is the vision that you and some of your scholars there at AEI have for getting us out of this situation that we're in and into a more productive national dialogue and place where we can address some of these concerns that a lot of people recognize as issues that want to be addressed, but we keep, spinning around in circles over them?
So our scholars' collective work would say that there are really two solutions and one for each party. And so on the Republican side, there are aspects of national populism concerning immigration, concerning entitlements, concerning trade, concerning foreign wars that are legitimate critiques of the old sort of Bush-Reagan Republicanism that we needed to hear. Turns out, vast majority of Americans really, really want their retirement benefits, and they don't want to hear all the time about how they're bankrupting the country. They feel they worked for them, they paid for them, and they want them. And to go around saying that our job is to cut them, not going to really put it over. It turns out immigration was a problem. We like immigration theoretically, but we don't like it when it's illegal and it's putting pressure on all kinds of services that are provided by social services agencies and education, and it's not consistent with the rule of law. Foreign wars that lead to lots of American casualties in wars that don't seem to lead to any satisfactory conclusion, disastrous. And traditional Republicans needed to hear that. And so there's an element of national populism that is good. And trade, we were abused by the Chinese and others in our trade relationships, and that was harmful to working class Americans. So I think that for Republicans, they need to acknowledge those things, but at the same time, discard the grievance, the heavy grievance emphasis, the belief in state solutions, the racism, the sort of discarding of the other, the person who's different, the lack of respect for American diversity, that is also part of national populism, sort of hawking back to the know-nothings. I mean, there's an element of that that can't be part of the Republican Party's platform. So that would be one solution on one side. On the other, and I just have to tell you that the capture, and we have a scholar, Rui Teixeira, who is the foremost scholar of what's wrong with the Democrats. And, he will go through patriotism. 75% of Hispanic Americans think the United States is the greatest country in the world. But only 25% of progressive Democrats say the United States is the greatest country in the world. And why would Hispanics want to be part of a party that's run by progressive Democrats that don't see their country the same way they see it? A lot of Americans have great faith. They really believe in their faith, their church, their synagogue. There's a lack of respect for faith sometimes in the Democratic Party. There are issues concerning racial preferences that it turns out Americans don't like racial preferences. They really don't like putting your thumb on the scale for someone because they're Black or Hispanic or Asian, one way or the other. And the Democrats have had a hard time abandoning racial preferences. So my view is on the Democratic side, if they would come to their senses on some of these more cultural issues, and nominate someone who truly wasn't captured by the progressive left, in the sort of, the most recent, the classic example is Bill Clinton. Then they might develop a leader that could help bring the country together. But so long as both parties refuse to reject their base, we're going to continue to have this really unpleasant political environment. But I want to be clear, it's both parties' problem, and it really is, and we see it every day.
Well, and anyone out there who is interested in reading some of that scholar you mentioned, Rui Teixeira, you can find his work at the Liberal Patriot on mostly on the Democratic Party. Yeah, a little plug for you and AEI. But he does some fascinating work, and it's all on the Democratic Party and left of center politics, which is where he comes from. Well, Robert, I wish we had another hour. We could spend a lot more time talking about these things, and we had a lot more questions I wasn't able to get to. I apologize for that, but I do want to thank you again, Robert, for such an insightful debate on this timely set of issues. Also, a big thanks to our audience for joining us this evening and taking an interest in these issues. Please do check out our upcoming events on the Mansfield Center's website, and good night.
Thank you very much. I've greatly enjoyed this. I appreciate being invited.